They pressed toward some unknown destination. Extremely tired and a tad hungry, they were all bunched together as an easy target, with night gaining on them. Proceeded markedly unabated behind their fearless leader. Just then the captain stopped dead in the center of the trail. This caused both Lester and Margot to look up again with caution. Nothing above. The crew then tried to peer through the jungle around them at what might be the fuss. Margot noticed that the captain was slowly pulling up his sword with as little physical movement as possible. "What is it, Cap?" Copper whispered. Copper was standing immediately behind the captain when he heard his comrade let out a low, "Now easy there, friend. We come to do you no harm." It was not a growl that responded, but heavy breathing and a low, straining rumble. But Margot and the others could sense the fire behind it and backed up accordingly. And then, suddenly, arching itself with wings spread wide, the dragon flung itself into the sky, casting flames from its mouth overhead, but curiously not firing at them. Out of what seemed pure frustration, the creature lit up the surrounding trees like a mountain-sized bonfire, but they, Margot and Les, alas, had not thought to bring any marshmallows and hoped the fiery frenzy would burn out and the remarkable, beautiful creature would calm down. As if echoing their thoughts, the captain rang out, "Whoa there now, calm down." In obedience, but done with great effort, the amazing creature landed in front of them, right on top of a portion of the jungle it had just scorched, conveniently making it more palatable for its rear end. They all stood awestruck at the size, power, not to mention fairy-tale-ness, according to Margot and Lester, of this magnificent dragon, now perched on the crispy foliage. He was looking as dejected as a fairy-tale creature could. The mass of power and destruction sunk its head low onto the ground like a sad dog. "There now!" Captain figured he might as well keep yelling, as if the stormy, forlorn dragon could not hear him. "Cap," Copper interjected, "he looks awful sad." "Not deaf," remarked Les under his breath. The group huddled closer to it, and Marg and Les waited for some insight from the captain. He seemed to understand more about what was going on than even the crew, despite his frenzied yelling. "Are you the last of them?" Byron slowly exhaled a question that likely pained him, but no answer came. Just then the dragon lifted its muscular neck to look behind at some source unknown to the crew that grabbed its attention. Byron pulled his sword without caution this time, and the dragon saw it. With a shriek and a really bad temper, the giant escaped to the sky again, just to turn toward earth and aim himself at the small crew. It was every man and team for themselves, and everyone scattered. "Whoa!" came out a shout from behind the brush. When all seemed lost, all was not with the calm, firm voice coming from within the brush. Then appeared a little man from where that voice had emerged. He was dressed rather ruggedly. He wore a grass hat, and his eyes were like dark crescents. He held a staff before him as he came out of the greenery, and all were astonished at the sight. "Jasper!" Byron bellowed from within himself in motion quite close to great relief and joy. "Byron, my dear fellow, what a sight you are to behold!" The man blinked at the sight of the ragtag team of cohorts. "It is just so good to see all of you." "You are looking rather well, Jas. What have you been up to?" Byron's smile somewhat faded, waiting for the response. "Oh, just surviving, my friend." Jasper paused as though he might go mute, but settled himself again into the conversation. "What of you, old boy, and this fantastic crew?" Byron was having none of the niceties. "Are you the last of them?" That I am, Byron. You always did skip the weather talk." Jasper leaned on the staff that had only appeared to be there for aesthetic purposes, but now seemed irreplaceable for the weary man. "Who is he?" Byron said, looking at the dragon that had settled back down on the burned-out brush. "That's old Potter, the most recent," he said, as he walked over to caress the large nose, faithful to the end. The dragon pulled back slightly under the radar of everyone around. "What of the others?" "A lot of them are dragons, or as some call them dinosaurs, but some followed the man of the shadows." Sadly, Jasper looked up to the sky, as if trying to get one last glimpse of those lost to a fight. "Sad." Byron looked shaken to the core. "Cap," interjected Copper, "might he come with us?" "Leave this place?" "Yeah," encouraged Margot, fully supporting the idea. We'll discuss this in the morning, my friends. But nightfall is coming, and we know what that means. Byron looked around at his men and at Jasper again, and they all agreed with various kinds of nods and a tad bit of intensity. Let's get these kids out of the night air then, shall we? Jasper motioned them all to follow. Jasper led them to a cave, continuing along the same tiny trail. The cave was as cozy as a dragon's lair might be, with a small fire close to the entrance. Jasper left Margot and Lester there, sitting around the fire with a pile of blankets and some food, mostly consisting of what one might find in a jungle. But mangoes for dinner worked just fine when your stomach was absolutely eating itself with hunger. The blankets were way too many for just two of them. Les wondered who they had once belonged to as he felt their coarseness. They seemed quite old. A few had noticeable gaping holes in them. He could not shake the image of Potter, laid down on top of the smoldering forest, covered in overwhelming sadness. The injustice of it all was burrowing a deep hole within Lester's heart, and the feeling was surprising. He had not at all felt up to or adequate for this war, but then he pulled out the sword that Byron had given him and set it across his knees to stare at it. What? Margot entered his thoughts. Nothing. Lester glanced up at her, shaken from his wanderings. We shouldn't let the fire go out. Nightfall settled in with an uneasy feeling and a harsh wind. Margot and Lester were so turned around that it was hard to tell from where the gusts were coming from, north, south, east, or west. Both of them were eternally grateful, however, for the huge pile of blankets. Needless to say, they were very tired. All of the crew had disappeared farther into the eerie cave. The solemn flickering of the fire only reminded them of their desertion, and Margot felt she could no longer bear the pressure, remembering what had happened the night before. So what are we supposed to do if the shadow men come again? Lester more felt than heard her exasperation. He understood her fears, so his response was slow. Margot, do you remember when we were kids, what Dad would say to us when we were scared? After Mom died? Margot's cheeks grew warm with the heat from the fire and the emotional recollection. Yeah. Lester studied his sister's response, hoping she would find strength in the words they had heard so long ago. Fear is something we can choose to ignite into a bonfire that will eventually overwhelm us, or we can contain it and use it for our benefit. But we can't do anything about what will or won't happen in the future. Margot sighed. I know. It is just so easy right now that everything we ever knew is gone, to get overwhelmed. She looked down contemplating as silent tears fell. Here's what we do know, sis. Lester leaned in, putting his sword close at hand should something come up. I would rather die than let anything happen to you. Margot looked up through the tears that flooded her eyes. Thanks, Les. Margot lay down and curled up with the excessive amount of coverings, further recalling and even smiling a bit at the memories. I remember how Dad used to tell us that while showing us how to start a campfire. Every time. Lester looked up at the clear, starry sky with a grin as well. He always forgot the kindling. A shifting was taking place through the bushes that night. The sounds were unrelated to anything the isle presented. They were making their way up the beach and through the jungle. Animals ducked in for cover as it passed, and branches cracked and fell in its wake. Margot had some trouble sleeping. Her dreams were flashes of light that bombarded her with color-saturated landscapes completely unfamiliar to her. Glimpses of her brother emerged before her mind's eye. She saw him wrestling unknown phantoms, and Byron in his bare form was crouched low to the ground, apparently wounded. Swirls of darkness aimed to likely swallow everything physically around her suddenly subsided to that strange piercing light that filled her heart with warmth. This discontented sleep abruptly ended with a flood of sound and a roar of a bear. Margot and Lester woke to find themselves in a strange place, totally different than the one they had fallen to sleep on. The dark island emerged like a ship, as that was the only way to describe it. It was just coming to the surface of the same ocean that Deborah sailed on. Or was it the same one? Jasper! Roar! Came the growl of a very angry bear man. What's wrong? Lester immediately realized something had gone very awry during the night. He grabbed the tiny mouse that was metamorphosizing right in front of his eyes, as if in direct contrast and rebellion against this dark, shrinking place they suddenly found themselves on. Squeak! Squeak! We've been tricked! "Jasper!" came the mixed roar again. "Who tricked us, Copper?" Les looked around at the strange, barren, dark landscape. It lay in direct contrast to the place teeming with life that they had met Jasper and Potter on. It was unbearable to look at, black and ashen, vacant and cold. "Jasper," Copper hurriedly whispered as he blanketed himself with his clothing quickly before he fully transformed. "He's become one with the shadow." It all made sense now. The sudden appearance of the island, the timely appearance of Jasper, the eerie cave, and the sad, very sad dragon. "He wasn't going to kill us," thought Lester. "He was trying to scare us off." Poor Potter. "What do we do?" Margot felt a tad guilty that she was glad that all of them were captured instead of just her. Well, at least seemed like they were captured. "There's little hope for us now." Copper looked around, following Lester's lead, his eyes overwhelmed with concern. He looked as though he might try to grab Margot in the relative safety of his arms and run. "We must find a trail we came by, kids. The tiny line might lead us back to the Deborah." Byron was fully transformed, hollering and bellowing G-rated curse words to all that would heed him. "When the time comes," a few colorful expletives here and there, "I'll be dragged no further, you'll see." A few more. "Justice will have her way. Come higher water or hay." For his part, Lester was pretty sure Byron could have avoided this whole thing and had some serious doubts about what all this trash talking would accomplish. He grabbed his sister's arm and headed toward a certain lost cause with full gusto. "We're better together, lad," cautioned Byron without missing a beat. "I'm afraid you're stuck with me," expletive, "for the time being anyway. Running away solves nothing." He suddenly looked withdrawn. "I've tried that." One of the crewmen shouted out that a trailhead could be made out in the ashen-colored dirt, and immediately everyone else rushed over to see for themselves. "They ain't gonna let us leave without a fight." Whether this was a statement or a question was left in its confused state as Byron looked around in an expectant manner, sword drawn. Lester followed his gaze as well, fear gripping him with a slow certainty. What do we do? Just then 1,000 ugly monsters and sea creatures, half human, half death itself, surrounded them on all sides. The crew seized what arsenal they had strapped to their belts and froze in the calm before the storm. Byron lifted his gaze and steadied his shoulders, his sword shining like a beacon against the dark desert. "Men, the weapons you fight today are unlike any you've ever lifted a sword against before. But take heart." "Lester, do I say Dad's name?" Margot queried under her breath, frozen in fright. "That won't work here." Copper, who had been standing close by, heard her question and settled the issue further. "This is a different kind of test." Just when Lester's attention snapped into Copper's direction, the hordes attacked. "Keep your eyes in the middle of the fight, ladies and gents." Byron winked at Margot. "Neither right nor left." "I have nothing to fight with." This was mentioned not without emotion by Margot as hordes of enemy shadowmen swept in on the small group of renegades. "Sure you do, Margot. Just find your will to fight." Copper ran up to the side of her and looked at her with one of his strange knowing looks. "It's not fair." Fear was taking over her as she continued. "All they want is me. Why me? All I want is to see my dad." Lester was fighting off the strange creatures as best he could in front of her. "Can you guys figure this out?" Lester called out behind him between sword-clashing jabs. "Soon." Margot looked around at the battle scene. Jasper appeared now dark and evil, such a contrast to when they had first met him. The look that had made him appear so endearing was gone. He had with him a few dragons matching his dark demeanor. Want for power was an age-old force to reckon with, but betrayal came on always as a shock and never easy to deal with. Margot was sad to see Byron still desperately trying to talk to the villain that had so cleverly disguised himself. He who was once his friend. So between flame-throwing attempts and death threats, he pleaded with tears in his eyes. Suddenly, the compassion Byron maintained struck Margot to the core. It invoked a yearning to see good prevail somehow. She drew up her hands in front of her in defense of the onslaught, and suddenly a shield and a sword appeared on her arm and in her hand. They were glowing as bright as the sun, almost blinding her. "There you go, Missy." Copper smiled in her direction again, knowingly, and with battle cry faced his overwhelming opponent. Slowly the troop found their way to the narrow pathway. They, by degrees, progressed along it, not without trepidation, not without fear like they had never known before, yet even in the blackest of moments they were never alone. They had each other. Finally Lester let out an exasperated yelp. "I won't make it!" which did little to startle the captain, who was trudging bravely up ahead. "Ah, me lad," grunted the captain with a thrust of his sword, "none of us will, if you do not." Copper reiterated simply, "We cannot fail, Lester, and we must try with all our might." Lester wasn't sure if Copper meant that it was impossible for the crew to fail no matter what befell them, or if their pursuit was of utmost importance. Perhaps both, but he knew for sure that Copper meant for him to continue, though every ounce of energy was failing him, and he didn't want to go any further. The blue waters of the ocean finally crept into their view like an unlikely mirage, though at various intervals it disappeared as the crew was pushed back against the fray of opposition. There was still no sign of the Deborah, only a line of the clearest blue that Les and Margot ever laid eyes on. This sight alone filled Margot and Lester with inescapable hope. The fight was still desperate, the fears were more real than the dark ashen ground they were walking on, yet the sight of those clear, beautiful waters enveloped them and charged them to keep pressing forward no matter what. At last they reached the beginning of the final stretch to the beach. It was here, near the light gray sands that were similar to the ones that lined the coast of Washington, that Byron finally showed his concern. He paused abruptly, glaring over the last hill, the smell of the sea wafting up the grassy dark dune. "Byron, what is it?" queried Lester. He trudged up behind him to catch a glimpse of what he was looking at, quickly to discover it was what he wasn't looking at that was the problem. The Deborah was gone. From behind him they could hear a dark, evil sort of echo of a laugh that gathered up their shivering spines with its solid demonstration. Byron turned to the source to see Jasper in his distorted form, with a whole host of dark figures like ominous clouds emerge without the benefit of very much distance between them. "So we're stuck here then?" Margot looked around the watery landscape for the least bit of hope. "We have to give in to them? What will they do with me?" Byron looked at her with not a very small sum of pity, but also a look of what seemed to be exasperation which crossed his brow line. Jasper bellowed, "What will you do, Byron, you fool?" "Haven't you learned, Margot," Byron said slowly, "that with every ounce of trust, a miracle follows?" "Make it snappy," Lester interjected. "He's right," Copper engaged. "We really do not have all day." The small crew faced away from their sky-blue hopes to face the onslaught coming up behind them. Margot stood perplexed by the pressure she now felt. She wasn't sure what to hope for. She had only begun to learn what this faith was about. She recalled that with a new courage, also a will to see good prevail, the sword and shield emerged right in her hands. This time it was just a semi-large sailing vessel that was missing. Yes, it would be nice if it would reappear, great even, an inescapable relief, but was there more to it? She glanced back at the shattered souls that drew their swords like age-old enemies with a depth of evil she had never encountered before. These creatures were once whole, but had surely forgotten what it was to have a conscience, what it was to share in love, what it was not to have enemies to fight as their whole purpose. She suddenly felt compassion. The same compassion Byron might have felt toward Jasper, perhaps. Surely they weren't meant to just sail away and not reflect some kind of hope. Was there any hope to share? She turned back to the vacant ocean and hiked over the last hill to the glassy water and stared at her reflection inside of it. Inside the water she found a vision of peace, more beautiful than she had ever seen. She saw everyone she knew in the water. She could see her family, old friends, and even new friends. The Deborah was there, but it was not Byron that stood at the wheel. It was her mom and dad. Tears streamed down her face, and she called for her brother to join her. "Look," she said. She was afraid that it was all just a dream, like many times before. "Do you see what I see?" Lester seemed perplexed by this untimely hiatus from the battle, but looked in the same direction Margot had been looking. "Is that?" He gasped with recognition. "Yes, Lester, yes, I think it is." They both cried and embraced each other, only to look up in the middle of it all and see the Deborah right before them, as if she had never disappeared. With this, Margot stepped out onto the water, looked behind her, and beckoned the others to follow. "Lester," she called behind her, "we don't need a boat or anything else. We don't need Dad to be here for us. We don't need a better life in Seattle." Lester finished her thought quietly as the waves muffled out her voice. "We need to be whole." Byron suddenly stood beside him with the largest grin on his face yet Lester had yet seen. This was a man who smiled often. Les did not have to ask him by now what he was smiling at. "Are we going?" Byron looked over at Lester. "Can we do some good here if we do?" Lester's question was all-encompassing. It was not about escape. It was not about destination. It was about the bigger picture. Lester was offering himself, sacrificing his service if Byron thought it would be useful. "Let's go get the birds." Byron responded with an answer that resonated in every eardrum in the vicinity. A hearty yell came from the crewmen in response. Each in turn took their walk on the water. So setting the women free, long captured by the man of the shadows, was not going to be any kind of an easy task, Margot realized as she climbed aboard the ship. The crew had not eaten for a while, so they were now settled down to a meal without any further thoughts about the future. The teenagers, as well, were temporarily distracted, gazing upon the size of the portions that the crew ate. They ate like, well, animals. Margot was surprised that they were not transforming right in front of her into the ravenous creature forms they inhabited at night, but the crew was well aware of what time that would happen and were careful about the precautions they took for the benefit of the female guest, turned leader. Byron, in a solemn disposition, sat down beside Margot and Lester, and with honest, sober eyes burrowed holes in all the expectations Margot might have had about the pending discourse. "Margot," he said, "it's time." Without unduly dragging out the theme, he continued, "It's time for you to lead the crew." Margot almost dropped her food and looked over at Lester for support, who continued to eat his food as if nothing in particular was taking place at all, as if their food wasn't merely hardtack and dried meat, but a spread like Thanksgiving dinner itself. "What?" Margot's mind went utterly blank. "You heard me," Byron responded steadily. "And how on earth do you Margot was quickly cut off. "Now don't go leaning on your own devices again." Byron laughed out loud heartily. "We're all done for if you do." Margot peered over the ocean, remembering the impossible circumstances they had just escaped without the help of her know-how or weak knees. "No, Byron." She looked intently at him with all sincerity and continued, "No, I will not." "Good. What better thing to do than to send a girl," he coughed to disrupt himself, "woman to rescue our women." Made sense to Lester, who continued eating to affirm his consent. "You can do it, sis," barely looking up with a mouthful of dried crackers. "Cap?" Copper jolted to a stop in front of Baron without a clue as how to proceed. "Are you still Cap?" "You can call me Baron, Copper." Baron motioned to Margot proudly. "This is your new captain, Captain Maggie." Margot gulped heavily. "What is it, Copper?" "It's near nightfall, Miss Cap'n." Copper cautiously continued, "Should we settle ourselves in?" "Yes." Margot was at least pretending to have confidence now. "You do that." She shot a sideways glance and admitted to herself that it would give her time to think about their next course of action. "Very good," Byron hollered for all to hear, then lowly added, "I'm here if you need me," in Margot's direction with a wink and a quick glide below deck. As all the crew filed off, the weight of the responsibility crept in from various unseen edges of this new, very cool, but awfully strange world the kids were navigating. The realization threatened to commandeer her very breath. "I'm not going to make it."